further ado, I'm going to introduce Michael Dalto. I'll let him tell a little bit about himself, and then he'll be sharing his screen. Again, please stay muted for the entire session. If you have any difficulties or questions, please type them into the chat. We will try our very best to get to all of your questions, and we'll be taking breaks on the hour, so we'll have a little break at 6 and a little break at 7. I know it's a long time to sit and watch a webinar. So thank you very much, and welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Melissa. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, put up the PowerPoint. And hope that's visible.
Yes, it is.
It is. Okay, wonderful. All right, I won't bore you with a lot of background about myself, except that I've been doing this for about 30 years. And I have a son who is now 30 years old. And if you ever meet him, please promise that you won't tell him that I told this story in public, because it occurred when he was toilet training. I remember after he'd been practicing this new skill for several months, I took him out on sort of a test run, and he got dressed in his big boy underpants, no diaper. And I drove for 15 minutes, and every single minute I turned around and asked him, "Do you have to go?" He kept shaking his head no. And I arrived at our destination, parked the car, unstrapped him, lifted him out of his car seat. And I know you're all parents, so you know what I discovered. Of course, he was soaking wet. And I said to him, "I asked you every minute if you had to go. Why didn't you say something?" He looked at me with these big innocent eyes and said, "But I wanted it to be a surprise." And that was the day that I learned that my son might have a future working for Social Security, because you usually get the information you need, but it's often just a little bit too late. So I hope that you're getting this information in a timely way tonight. We're going to be speaking primarily about SSI and medical assistance, also known as Medicaid, which comes along with SSI. Be talking about lots of details about what SSI is, who's eligible, how to apply, how to make sure you get as much SSI as possible, what to do if you're denied, how to speed up your application. But I understand that some of you may be getting, or may have family members who are getting or applying for a different benefit, namely Social Security Disability. And we will be talking a little bit about Social Security Disability in the last part of the presentation. So I'm happy to answer questions about that as well. But generally, for transition age students, SSI is going to be the benefit they'll receive or that they'll be applying for. So who is eligible for SSI? First of all, SSI stands for Supplemental Security Income. And that's different from Social Security Disability Insurance, which is SSDI. That's what we'll be covering in the last part of the presentation. So this highlights rule number one for bureaucrats trying to confuse the public. You give very different benefits, very similar names. SSI and SSDI are only one letter different, but they're very different benefits. So SSI is a benefit for people of any age who are disabled. And we'll talk more about what disabled means in a moment. Or people can qualify for SSI even if they're not disabled, if they're age 65 or older. But naturally, we're going to be focused on younger people who are disabled qualifying for SSI. Also have to be a US citizen or a legal alien who meets certain requirements. And you have to have financial need. You have to have income and assets, which Social Security calls resources, below certain limits. Now, the whole purpose of the SSI program is to make sure that people who are eligible have at least a basic minimum level of income that they can use to pay primarily for food and shelter. And when you think about it, if a person has no other income, you would expect they could get the maximum SSI benefit. If they have other income, it would be logical that they wouldn't get as much SSI because they wouldn't need as much to meet their basic food and shelter costs. And that concept is going to come in handy when we talk about work and SSI. As your other income goes up, your SSI goes down. And the flip side of that is if your other income goes down, your SSI goes up. So the relationship between SSI and other income is like a balance or a scale. As one side goes down, the other side goes up, and vice versa. We'll get to that later. So one criterion is you have to have a disability. How disabled do you have to be? I'm going to be focused on adults and older, but I will mention that children under 18 can sometimes qualify for SSI if their parents have limited finances. But most children are not eligible for SSI because their parents have too much money. But they can be 18 when they're considered adults. And at age 18, only their own. So an adult who's 18 or older has to have a severe disability that's lasted or is expected to last at least a year, or it's a terminal illness. And that disability
Michael?
that a
Michael,
person must be. Yes.
I think you're cutting in and out a little bit. You may have lost the last thing that you said.
Okay. So thank you. Please let me know if I cut in or out again, Melissa. So notice I did not say that the person's disability has to completely prevent them from working. That's a myth. A person can be capable of working. They could even be working when they apply for SSI. But their disability has to limit their ability to work, has to prevent them from doing what Social Security considers to be substantial work. They use the term substantial gainful activity because rule number 2 for bureaucrats trying to confuse the public is never use one syllable if 9 would do just as well. So they call it substantial gainful activity, and that generally means earnings of $1,260 a month or more. So a person who's considered unable to earn much can still qualify for SSI. And a person earning less than that amount could still qualify for SSI even if they're already working when they apply. Now, in some cases, a person's earnings could be greater than $1,260 a month, but they could still be considered to not be performing substantial gainful activity if they had certain subtractions from their earnings. I won't go into those right now, but generally a person who's considered unable to earn more than $1,260 a month or who is already earning less than that may meet the disability requirement for SSI. Now, there are some special rules for people who are labeled blind according to Social Security's definition. They, for one thing, have certain advantages regarding work, how work affects their SSI. Now, for a person to be considered blind, according to Social Security's definition, the vision in their better eye with correction has to be 20/200 or worse, or their field of vision has to be 20 degrees or less. Now, a person who meets that definition would be considered statutorily blind. A person who does not meet that definition, but who has a vision impairment, might still qualify for SSI, but they wouldn't be eligible for the special work rules that they could get if they met that definition of blindness. Another advantage is that a person who is considered blind may be considered capable of doing substantial gainful activities, substantial work, but could still be eligible for SSI, even if they're considered able to earn over $1,260 a month. Now, I'm going to pause now and then to answer some questions that you had submitted in advance. And one question was, most of the people I've known who receive SSI benefits have a high school certificate. What are the chances that a person with a high school diploma and who works part-time can get SSI benefits? Another question is, how can a person with disabilities survive if, on one hand, the person can only work part-time, and on the other hand, he or she has been denied SSI benefits? So in answer to the first question, many people who have high school diplomas can qualify for SSI. And as I mentioned before, some people who are working at the time that they apply for SSI may still be eligible if their earnings are considered to not be substantial gainful activity. So if they're either earning under $1,260 a month, if they're not blind, or they're earning more than that, but there are certain subtractions from their earnings that are allowed. And after the subtractions, what's left is below $1,260 a month. Now, I wanted to show you something on Social Security's website. Okay, so is my screen visible, Melissa, the Google? Okay, great. All right, so what I'm doing here, you may want to take notes on this. I'm typing in Social Security's website, ssa.gov, ssa.gov. I'm in the home page. What I'm going to be doing is showing you Social Security's criteria for disability for a variety of disabilities. So I'm on the home page, in the upper right portion. I'm clicking on search. There's a search field, putting my cursor in the middle of the search field, and I'm typing listing of impairments. I'm going to search that. The second link that pops up is listing of impairments, adult listings, part A. That's what I want to click on. And now what you'll see is a list of different body systems: musculoskeletal system, special senses in speech, respiratory disorders, etc. And what you would want to do to see if your child might likely be eligible for SSI, or at least might have a disability that might qualify them, is you'd first want to find which of these body systems or criteria would most closely match their disability. Now, if your son or daughter has autism, you're going to go to mental disorders, 12.00. Click on that. And then the middle of the page, there are somewhat more specific diagnoses. And scrolling down, you'll find 12.10 is autism spectrum disorder. If you click on autism spectrum disorder, it's going to give you a set of criteria. Person has to meet these criteria in order to be easily approved based on disability for SSI. Okay. I'm not going to read through them. You can do that at your leisure. Now, I did want to point out that this is definitely the easiest way a person's disability can be demonstrated to meet Social Security's criteria. If they meet the criteria listed here precisely. If the person does not meet all of those criteria, they could still potentially be eligible for SSI. For example, if they have more than one disability, oftentimes the combination of disabilities may qualify them for SSI, even if their disabilities in this list. But looking at these criteria under the listing of impairments can be very helpful to give you an idea of whether your child may meet the disability criteria. Another thing that's useful about this listing of impairments and the specific criteria is if you're trying to gather documentation of disability for your son or daughter, and we're going to go into more detail about that a little later. And let's say you want to get a report from a physician, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, that will help establish that they meet this definition of disability. What you can do is copy these criteria into an email it to the healthcare provider, and tell them, if my son or my daughter meets these criteria, they'll be eligible for SSI, or at least they'll meet the disability requirement. Can you please look at these criteria when you're writing up a summary of my son's or daughter's disability? Because if they use these particular criteria in their report, it'll be much easier for the disability examiner who's evaluating their disability to say, oh, yep, looks like their disability matches these criteria. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint now. Okay, and is that visible now, Melissa? Okay, great. All right. And the second part of that question was, and I feel your pain, if a person's denied SSI and they can only work part-time, how are they supposed to get by? Well, we will be talking about how to appeal the denial of an SSI application a little bit later. And if you successfully appeal an SSI denial, with rare exception, once it's approved, will be retroactive. I know that's cold comfort if you've got too little income to live on while you're waiting, but in the end, it means you'll get a significant amount of money, including that back payment. And I'll be explaining how you can get help navigating the system involving SSI and work, and how you can get some advice regarding the deductions from earnings that could enable someone to earn more than $1,260 a month and still be eligible for SSI initially, still not be considered to be doing substantial gainful activity. Another question was, how would applying as a visually impaired individual affect my driver's license? Well, I went onto the Motor Vehicle Administration's website and found this quote: drivers aged 40 and over must have their vision results submitted electronically by an authorized online vision certification provider if you're applying for a license renewal online. And the vision certification must be within 12 months of renewing. So it's the vision exam that may prevent you from continuing to get your driver's license or get it renewed, rather than the fact that you've applied for benefits from Social Security, SSI, or Social Security Disability. Now, of course, if your vision is poor enough that you expect you might qualify for SSI or Social Security Disability, it's probably not safe for you to be driving. Okay, next slide. What is the income limit? That depends on the kind of income you get. Now, Social Security for SSI, the SSI program, divides income into two kinds: unearned income and earned income. So earned income is going to be money that you received as compensation for work you've done, such as wages, self-employment income, tips, royalties, salaries, commissions if you're a salesperson, etc. And unearned income is going to be basically anything else: Social Security disability payments, pensions, interest, dividends, unemployment benefits, etc. Okay, suppose you have only unearned income and you're applying for SSI. Generally, your unearned income, such as Social Security, etc., would have to be less than $803 a month for you to qualify for any SSI. Suppose you have only earned income, so you're applying for SSI, you're working, you have wages, you have no other income. Well, remember, initially, your earnings would probably have to be under $1,260 a month, which we saw on the previous slide, or possibly higher if you had enough deductions from earnings so that the difference would be under $1,260. But after you'd begun to receive SSI, you could be earning up to $1,650 a month and still receive $1 of SSI. So this is an interesting point about SSI. Earnings need to be below one level when you apply, but after you've been approved for SSI, you can actually earn more and still receive some SSI. Okay. So there's also a limit on resources. This is Social Security's term for assets, savings, property, etc. And that resource limit is only $2,000. Let you save a lot. And resources that they count include money markets, other kinds of investments, whole life insurance that has a cash value, retirement accounts, and property other than the home that you live in. But here's the most important part. There are some types of assets or resources that the SSI program does not count. The home that you live in, You could own $1 million home with no mortgage. You could own it free and clear. As long as you live in it, it will not count as a resource, and you could still get SSI. One motor vehicle is not counted. If you have more than one, they will count the value of one of them. Life insurance that has no cash value, like term insurance, that's the kind where you can't cash it in unless the person dies. Certain burial funds are not counted. Many of you are probably familiar with special needs trusts. If those are drawn up correctly, they don't count as resources for SSI either. If you're not familiar with special needs trusts, they are special accounts set up generally with the help of an attorney or created by a nonprofit agency. Money can be placed into the trust to benefit a person with a disability, but the person with a disability does not own the money that's in the trust. It's owned by this legal entity called the trust. The person with a disability also cannot withdraw money from the trust. The only person who can take money out of the trust is the trustee. That's the person who's responsible for managing the money in a trust. It can be a family member, a close friend, an attorney, a financial planner, etc. And the trustee is only allowed to withdraw money from the trust to pay for expenses on behalf of the person with the disability. So it's a way for a person with a disability to get the benefit of money without that money counting as a resource, without it counting against that $2,000 limit. Special needs trusts are a great way, for example, for a relative to leave money in their will to a son, daughter, granddaughter, grandson, etc., with a disability, to leave them money without jeopardizing their SSI. Also not counted as a resource is property that's used for a job or a business, and that can even include liquid assets of a business. So if a person has a business, they've got a business bank account with the business name on it, that business bank account will not count as a resource if the business is either a sole proprietorship, a simple partnership, that's a sole proprietorship or a simple partnership. The last item on this list is the newest kind of resource that is not counted for SSI, and that's an ABLE account. And the next several slides, I'm going to go into some details about ABLE accounts. The first $100,000 in an ABLE account does not count as against that $2,000 resource limit for SSI. So what's an ABLE account? It's a special account that's opened by or on behalf of a person with a disability. The person's disability had to begin before age 26. And if you're on this webinar, I'm assuming you're on because of someone who most likely became disabled before age 26. But I do want to point out that a person can open an ABLE account at any age. They could be much older than 26, as long as their disability began before they turned 26, they'll meet that criterion. And as I mentioned, the first $100,000 that a person saves in their ABLE account does not count against that $2,000 resource limit for SSI and the medical benefit that comes along with SSI, which is known as medical assistance. It's also known as Medicaid. So a person with a disability actually owns an ABLE account. That's in contrast to a special needs trust, which is not owned by the person with a disability. So a person with a disability can own the account, they can open the account, or someone else can help them open it. Now, there is a limit on how much can be deposited to an ABLE account in any year, and that's $15,000 a year. But if the person with a disability is working and various contributors have reached that $15,000 a year limit, anybody can contribute to an ABLE account. Could be the person with a disability, a family member, a friend, an organization, could be a stranger. I've known some people with ABLE accounts who had GoFundMe pages and solicited contributions from strangers. Don't know how many they got, but I think it was a pretty enterprising way to go. But let's say various people contribute to a person's ABLE account and that $15,000 limit is reached. Well, if the person with a disability is working for pay, they could contribute additional money only out of their earnings, their wages, their self-employment income, and they could contribute up to more than $12,000 a year extra. So if the person with a disability is working, their ABLE account could potentially receive over $27,000 a year in deposits. So if you save money in an ABLE account, what can you use it to pay for? What can you withdraw it to pay for? Pretty broad array of expenses: education, housing, transportation, employment training and support, assistive technology, personal assistance services, attendant care, health, prevention and wellness services, financial management and administrative services, legal fees, expenses for oversight and monitoring, funeral and burial expenses even, and definitely living expenses, including food and shelter. And the law that created the ability for states to establish ABLE account programs even leaves the door open for the IRS, which has authority over these accounts, to approve other kinds of expenses in the future. So it's a pretty broad array of expenses. You can't use your ABLE account for certain things, can't use it to gamble, can't use it to buy gifts for other people, but you can use it for a variety of purposes. Now, when the law that enabled states to create ABLE account programs was passed in 2014, it said, well, if a person with an ABLE account dies and there's any money left in their ABLE account, the state can claim that remaining money to reimburse any expenses that were paid for that person after their ABLE account was opened through medical assistance, through the Medicaid program. But the state of Maryland passed a law a couple of years ago that said, we're not going to do that. If somebody has an ABLE account and they die, and there's money left in the ABLE account, we're not going to claim that money. We're going to let them leave it to an heir, leave it to a family member, for example. So score one for the Maryland General Assembly and the governor. Okay. Now, there is an exception to that, and this is true for anybody who gets medical assistance, also known as Medicaid. If the person is 55 or older, has received medical assistance at or after age 55, if they leave an estate with, I believe, $150,000 or more in it, if they have received long-term care services funded by Medicaid or medical assistance, then the state can put a claim on that money But that's true for anybody who gets medical assistance at or after age 55, whether or not they have an ABLE account. Now, you can open an ABLE account in any state that allows out-of-state residents to participate in their ABLE account program. And there are now, I believe, 42 states that offer ABLE accounts. But there's a compelling reason why a Maryland resident would want to open their ABLE account in the Maryland ABLE account program. And that is, there's an income tax deduction. Any Maryland resident who contributes to any Maryland ABLE account can deduct up to $2,500 a year of their contribution on their Maryland state income taxes. Now, that's a deduction, not a credit. So it won't save you $2,500. It would mean that $2,500 less of your income would be taxed by the state. So that might save you a couple $100. Now, ABLE programs give people generally a choice of maybe 5 or 6 different investment options, from very safe, like a bank account, to more aggressive, involving stocks and bonds. And you can choose to have some, portion of your money in one kind of investment and the rest in another. So Maryland does have an ABLE account program. It started November 2017. I believe the one way to get into it is marylandable.org. So you can open an account online. Another advantage to ABLE accounts is that the money that's deposited into them is not subject to any additional tax. And the withdrawals from ABLE accounts are not taxable so long as they're used for allowable purposes. If you wanted to get an idea of more details about ABLE programs, there was a handout about ABLE programs, and you can go to the ABLE National Resource Center, ablenrc.org. They've got lots more information. Okay.
Michael, we have questions whenever you feel you have a little break. Let me know.
Sure. I'm going to answer one question that I neglected, and then let's go ahead and open it up for a few questions, Melissa.
Sure.
So one question was, how can you get SSI if you or your child has assets, like retirement funds, college funds, etc.? And I wanted to go back to the slide where we talked about resources or assets. And this slide shows the kinds of assets or resources that the SSI program does not count. Details. One part of that question involved college funds or college savings plans. If a parent, grandparent, or other relative opens a college savings plan with the Maryland College Savings Program, that will not count as an asset to your child on whose behalf it's been opened. Okay. That would count as an asset to the person who opened the account, the parent, grandparent, etc. So that would not prevent the child from getting SSI. Now, if you're applying for SSI for your son or daughter who's under age 18, and again, they would only be eligible if the parents had limited income and resources. What would happen is a portion of the parent's money would be counted against the child under age 18. But the parents' retirement accounts would not be counted as resources for SSI. But again, most likely, most people on this call would not, their sons or daughters under age 18 would not be eligible for SSI because the parents would probably have too much money. Okay. And I think we'll go ahead and break for a few questions, Melissa.
Sounds good. Okay. Question is, let's see, someone who has had Social Security has been reviewing a disability case for her since February 2019. Is there a statute of limitations on how long Social Security can take to conduct a continued disability review? And then as part of that as well, she worked for a brief period of time for 4 months and wondering if that might impact the review of her case.
Okay. I wish there were something like a statute of limitations. Unfortunately, there's not. Now, I wasn't absolutely certain from the question whether this is an initial application or if this is a review, because when you get approved for SSI, periodically Social Security reviews your disability to make sure it has not improved. But either way, there's not technically a deadline that Social Security has to meet. However, if it's taking an unreasonable amount of time, and I'll tell you from February 2019 through 15 months later now, if that were a disability review for someone,
It is a review. It is a review.
somebody who's already getting SSI and the review, okay. That's quite a long time. And I think I would at that point try to contact the local office, see if you can get any information on the status of the review. And if you're not getting anywhere, at that point, I would go ahead and contact a member of Congress, your member of the House of Representatives or either of the state's US senators. Because if they submit a request to Social Security for information, there are specific procedures that Social Security needs to follow to respond to them in a timely way. So that may be a way to go.
Okay.
Now, the other part of that question, could 4 months of earnings have an impact on a disability review? I can't really give you a specific answer without knowing more details. I can tell you that if the person's earnings if the person is receiving SSI and their earnings were even high enough to reduce the SSI to 0, that should not affect their continuing to be considered medically disabled, believe it or not. They would only be considered to no longer be medically disabled if there's medical evidence that their disability has medically improved.
Okay.
Next question.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, the next question. And this person has some, let's see, if I mispronounce this, I apologize, keratoconus due to thinning of corneas, wearing special lenses to improve eyesight. Without my lenses, I am around 2400. With the lens, I'm around 2040. So where does that land me in applying for SSI?
Okay. If that's your only disability, then you would not be likely to be approved. First off, to repeat the definition of blindness that they use, vision has to be 20/200 or worse with glasses, with correction. So if with glasses, with correction, your vision is 20/40, it would be highly unlikely that you would meet that definition of having a severe disability, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you.
Next question.
My daughter has autism and ADHD and is trying to stay in college part-time. She's 21, not looking at the moment for work. She can apply. Can she apply for SSI or wait until later to see if she can obtain a degree part-time before applying?
Okay. If she's not planning to work for the time being so that she can complete her studies, this might be a very good time for her to apply for SSI. College students can be eligible. I mentioned earlier, people with high school diplomas can be eligible. People with just about any type of disability can be eligible. What matters is not so much the type of disability, but how severe it is and the fact that it limits your ability to work, though again, not necessarily preventing you from work. So I would say this is probably a good time for her to go ahead and apply for SSI now. And because she's over 18, only her own money will be counted and not her parents' money.
Okay, thank you. Let's do one more and then we'll
Okay.
see where we are. What does it mean to have a special needs trust set up correctly? And you may be getting to this later, I'm not sure.
Okay, I'm actually not going to be going into more detail about that later. What it means is you've had an attorney who is experienced in establishing special needs trusts, knows what the rules are, and has had that trust after it's been established, had the trust document reviewed by the state medical assistance or Medicaid agency. They have to review and approve a trust in order for the money in the trust to not be counted as a resource for Medicaid, for medical assistance. An attorney who knows what they're doing will do that routinely. Now, an alternative to setting up an individual special needs trust, where you're actually hiring an attorney to create the trust, is to join something called a pooled trust. A pooled trust is a large group trust set up by a nonprofit agency that's designed to benefit many people with disabilities. That means a person with a disability doesn't have to create a separate trust. All they have to do is open an account with this group trust, this pooled trust, which is a lot less expensive than creating a trust from scratch. Although you do have to pay annual fees for the trust to serve as trustee, to manage the money in the trust account for the person. If you opened an account with a pooled trust, then you wouldn't have to worry about whether the trust had been established correctly. It would certainly have been done correctly by the attorneys working with the nonprofit that created the pooled trust. Okay, thank you, Melissa. I'm going to go ahead and move forward.
Okay, great.
So what is the maximum SSI benefit that a person can get? For an unmarried individual, it's $783 a month this year in 2020. To be eligible for that maximum benefit, a person would need to be, an adult would need to be paying for food and shelter. They need to be paying their fair share of their food and shelter costs and their living arrangement to get that maximum $783 a month. If they're not paying at all for food and shelter, their SSI maximum would be reduced by 1/3. The most SSI they could get then would only be $522 a month. Okay. Now, of course, if you had other income besides SSI, that could reduce the amount of SSI they would get. But for somebody with no other income, just getting SSI, the maximum is $783 a month if they're not married and they are paying for food and shelter. It's only $522 a month if they're not paying for food and shelter. So suppose your son or daughter is getting $522 a month of SSI, the reduced amount, or you're initially applying for SSI for your son or daughter. What can you do to make sure that they'll get the maximum SSI of $783 a month rather than only $522 a month? Well, again, they'd have to be paying their fair share for food and shelter costs. There are two ways that can be done. The first way tends to be less advantageous and involves more administrative tasks. But I'm going to cover that first, and then we'll move on to the second one, which tends to be the preferred option. So if you're applying for SSI for your son or your daughter, or your son or daughter is already getting SSI, but they're only getting $522 a month, you can charge them for room and board. This assumes they live with you. And the first way would be to say, well, we live as a family. We pool our income. We pay our expenses in common. We are a family economic unit. If you present your son's or daughter's situation that way, they're part of your larger family economic unit, even though they're an adult, then they would need to pay their share of your household's food and shelter costs. So let's say, for example, there are 3 people living in your household, and the total expenses for food and shelter for your entire household were $2,100 a month, which is ridiculously small, but just humor me for this example for a moment. Well, since there are 3 people in the household, your son's or daughter's fair share would be 1/3 of that amount. 1/3 of $2,100 a month is $700 a month. So you would need to charge your son or daughter $700 a month in order for them to be able to receive the maximum $783 a month of SSI. Okay. Suppose they're initially applying for SSI. They have no money at all, so they can't pay you anything yet. There is a way, and actually Social Security taught me this loophole. You can explain to Social Security that you, the parents, are providing food and shelter to your son or daughter as a loan that must be repaid once they start getting SSI, because initially, when they're initially approved, their SSI payment will be retroactive. So when they get that first retroactive SSI payment, the first thing they need to do is pay you back the loan of food and shelter that you had provided. Okay, so let's say that you're going to be charging your son or daughter $700 a month, and it takes a year for them to get the first SSI payment. Well, that's going to be retroactive. It'll be $783 a month. You need to collect from them $700 a month for the 12 months, or $8,400. You take that out of the retroactive benefit right off the top. That's what's going to qualify them for $783 a month rather than only $522 a month. Okay. Couple of downsides to using this method, where you're considering your family to be a single economic unit. One is a catch-22. If you have a household of 3 people living in Howard County, particularly if you have a mortgage or you're paying rent, the total costs for food and shelter for your entire household will most likely be probably over like $2,400 a month. And then your son's or daughter's fair share would be more than $783 a month. In other words, even if they got the maximum SSI, they afford their fair share for food and shelter in your household. And you would think that in that case, they'd say, wow, well, then we should definitely give them the full SSI if their costs are that high. But instead, they don't. They say, no, unless you can afford to pay your fair share, your SSI will be reduced to $522 a month. The other disadvantage to this method is that you have to document, send proof of your living expenses for your household, your mortgage, your rent, your utility costs, your grocery bills, things like that, which is a hassle. The other option, since your son or your daughter is an adult, 18 or older, is to say that your son or daughter is a separate economic unit. They are an adult, they're responsible for paying their own expenses, their own living expenses. And you can say, well, they're living with our family, but they're essentially like a boarder, someone who's renting a room and receiving food and paying for it. If you present the situation that way, Social Security will ask you, the parents, how much are you charging your son or daughter for room and board as a boarder? And how much would you charge somebody for that room and board if they weren't related to you? If the amount that you're charging your son or daughter is the same amount that you would charge an unrelated boarder, then your son or daughter can get the full SSI instead of having it reduced. Now, many Social Security workers will pretty much take your word for it. If you say $500, $600, $700 a month, they'll say, fine, that's good enough. If you charge that much for room and board, we'll give your son or your daughter the full $783 a month SSI. Other Social Security workers are sticklers. And if you say, for example, I'm going to charge her $400 a month for room and board, they'd probably say, whoa, 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 that sounds awfully low. I doubt that you would charge an unrelated boarder that little for room and board. Show us some proof. What I recommend is that you go on Craigslist or some other list and find ads for rooms for rent in your area. Find some that would be very inexpensive. Take those ads as evidence and add on to that a reasonable amount for food. And that's going to be your proof that you're charging your son or daughter a reasonable amount. Now, there's a form that can be used to document this. It's called the SSA 8006 form. There's a link to it on this slide. The form name is Statement of Living Arrangements, In-Kind Support and Maintenance. But you'll find it at this link. And by completing that form, you can document what you're charging your son or daughter. And in the remarks section, if you're first applying for SSI, you can explain that you're providing the food and shelter as a loan that your son or daughter must repay when they get their SSI payments. Okay.
Michael, we're at 1 hour. I thought we'd take a short break.
Okay.
Let everybody stretch. and then just 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and get started. If that
Great.
sounds okay. All right.
Good. Thank you, Melissa.
Sure. Thank you.